Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, depending on what time you're watching us. This is Impact 2021. I am Nathaniel, and this is our conversation where we talk about social issues, where we talk about recent issues, where we talk about different issues from the perspective of Christians, from the perspective of wherever you come from, because this is a conversation that we continuously have. And this is a conversation that we want to have with you as well. So if you have questions, you have comments, please feel free to type those into the chat and we will discuss them. And for anyone who's new, this is our conversation. It started with social justice. It started with the fight for change. And it has continued on. And it's continued on as we've talked about what needs to be done. What does the church need to do? What do different communities need to do? Communities of color, diverse communities. What do men need to do? What do women need to do? What do the older population need to do? And what does the younger population need to do as well? And so here we are, again, having our conversation. So if you have anything that you want to say, please type it in. From time to time, we have guests that come through and continue the conversation. Tonight is not one of those nights. Tonight is a night where I wanted specifically to talk about something that happened recently that relates to social justice. And because of the nuanceness of the conversation, we want to kind of keep it available so that if people want to chime in, they can. And we're not a political show. This isn't a political leaning show. If you've watched or if you listen to me talk, you can probably figure out more so what more side did I lean towards, but we're not a political show. However, tonight, we're going to drop in on some politics. Because what happened recently this week was that the President Joe Biden, had the response to Congress. Sometimes they call it the State of the Union address. It wasn't technically one, but it is the speech that the president makes to both joint sessions of Congress, that is the House and the Senate. And he went and basically talked about what was going on in the country, talked about what he was able to do in his first 100 days, and so on and so on. That's not what we're talking about tonight. What we want to talk about is the rebuttal. And the rebuttal came from the lone Black Republican Senator, Tim Scott. And the reason that we want to talk about what he spoke about is because, one, he's a Black man who made probably the biggest speech of his life, the most notable speech of his life. The rebuttal to the president's technically State of the Union is a large platform, is a significant platform that one may have. But the reason that it applies to what we are talking about is because we are talking about social justice. We are talking about what has been happening to people of color, Black people, Black men and women being shot by police when they're unarmed. Talking about Asian Americans being attacked, basically because of some false narratives that were going on with COVID. And those are the things that he chimed in on. And so since that relates so much to what we've been talking about, we're just going to discuss that a little bit tonight. And so again, I remind you, this is an interactive conversation. Let's go ahead. Hopefully you watched it. And if not, you can still comment anyway. All right, so let's build the stage here. So Tim Scott made the response, his rebuttal. And during his rebuttal, of course, they talked regular things that Democrats and Republicans talk about, the economy. They talked about COVID and talked about the things that went on. But as a Black man, he wanted to discuss racism, but not racism, discrimination. The word racism only came out of his mouth one time when he was discussing a specific topic, and we'll go to that. But he was talking about discrimination. He said that he had experienced discrimination during his life. He's been pulled over as a Black man just for driving while Black. And then his following up comment was about how people on the so-called left called him the N-word and called him Uncle Tom, and so that really affected him. And then he went forward and said that the United States of America is not a racist country. So both citing those two different examples of racism that he cited, and then turned around and said it's not a racist country. And then and this is the part that, so more so the discussion point is, he went on to say that reverse racism, that now teaching people that about, and I'm going to be a little liberal here, about systematic racism and other things like that, are not effective, and it causes reverse racism. And he wanted to remind people who are not people of color that if you are not people of color, you're okay. It's not a problem there. And that was where he went. And also, he wanted to talk about in 2015, after the murder of Walter Scott. I don't know if you remember that one, due to police violence, that he came up with legislation to fund body cameras for police, and he also came up with some legislation to broaden legislation of police reform, and it was not successful. The Democrats didn't like it. From what some of the talk was back then, is that it just was it was a bill with no meat. And so he said that he had his bill, they didn't want to do it, now they want to do it. It's politics instead of, whatever. And so why are we discussing this? Why did I bring all of that up? Why did I say all of that? One other thing, and that we're going to talk about as well. He did say that becoming a Christian really transformed his life. But due to COVID, for much too long, churches were closed or churches were shut down. And then to get his words exactly, but for months, too many churches were shut down. So let's go ahead. First, let's do the last comment first. Being a Christian transformed his life, but for months, too many churches were shut down. Now, I don't know where you may be, and I don't know where most people may be, but churches really never shut down, and churches should never shut down. You may not have been able to go to Sunday service. You may not have been able to go to Bible study in the flesh. But as you can see us right now, or as you can see me talk right now, your church should have never shut down. Should have gotten on the web or gotten online. I know everybody can't do that. Your activities don't shut down. Your cell phone doesn't shut down. And so I don't know too many churches that shut down. And so for his comment to come there and talk about that in relation to, also talking about, being a black man in South Carolina, and you're talking about churches shut down. I just, a little bit problematic there. But we're gonna go over that. And we're gonna go into what he talked about. And so before we do, comment, people need to understand the definition of words. It is really impossible for African Americans to be racist. Good point. And that's what he did. He kind of wordsmithed a little bit, because you want to talk about the definition of racism versus discrimination. And racism is when you have the power. It involves the power to affect discrimination upon a race. You have to have the power that's mixed in. And discrimination is a little less in impact, because it doesn't have the power associated with you or with it. Discrimination is just, all right, I don't like you because of your skin color. I'm going to be mean to you because you're different from me. Discrimination doesn't have to be race. Discrimination can be anything. Racism is based in race, and it's based on oppression and the power to oppress based on race. And so we can talk about the first part is this. You give an example of racism. You say that you was pulled over for driving while black. That's discrimination or racism. It can be either one. You then turn around and you give the example that people are calling you the N-word and Uncle Tom. Technically, that's an example of racism. And then, as a black man, in your opportunity to come up and represent for black people, to talk about issues that affect black people, instead of going really into what you want to do and what changes you want to make and the police reform you talked about, barely, you gave as much time as you talked about police reform as you did to defending people, defending white people, to make them feel good, to make them, remind them that you're okay. So instead of taking your time to talk to your people, instead of taking your time to really talk about the policies you did, you spent your time talking about how other people are okay. So instead of talking to the folk who are sitting back here and upset because Andrew Brown Jr. just got shot in the back of the head driving away from the cops, and they won't release the tape, you spend time trying to comfort those who may have saw the video or may have felt a little bit like, oh my goodness, I'm depressed. Instead of spending the time to talk about the Asian Americans who are being beaten, who are being attacked because of a lie about COVID, and even if it was true, let's go. Even if there's some truth in what we're talking about, you're blaming COVID because it came from China. That does not give you any right to treat Asian Americans from the numerous countries that are in Asia, from India to Pacific Island Asia, all up and down that area, numerous different countries. It doesn't give you the right to attack and treat Asian Americans or Asians of any kind wrongly. But instead of talking about that, you want to make sure that you affirm and give a pass to people, to white people, so that they may feel better. And so, why is this important to what we do? As we talk about police reform, as we talk about what we need to do as individuals, as Black people, what we don't need to be doing is wasting our time. And I'll say it like that, wasting our time trying to make other people feel good. Because you don't want to make them feel too bad. You know, you don't want people to sit back and say, man, it is unfortunate that I am privileged because of how the system is set up. You don't want to say that there's systematic racism. And by definition, that just means that the systems that are built, and there's numerous definitions for how you can explain it, the systems that are built to have a impact and negative impact towards a race or towards races, the particular races, or in our situation, people of color. So that the system that was built, not that somebody's sitting there making racist judgments, but that the systems that were built. And if you say that, then well, when did it stop? Well, did it stop when slavery stopped? Well, then what happened with the Jim Crow laws and redlining? If you don't know what redlining is, that's where there was basically a red line that was drawn on maps to separate neighborhoods. Black people can live here and white people live here. Don't let Black people move across that red line. That was just outlawed, and then there was actually some teeth actually just put along in that in the last 30 years. It's 2020. Listen to what I'm saying, last 30 years. You're talking 1990s, 80s. And so what are you saying? You're saying, when did racism get out of the system? When did it disappear? When did it get pulled away? In the 2000s? Did it get pulled away in the 90s? It got pulled away in the 70s, in the 60s. Then it got pulled away with the Civil Rights Bill. When did it stop? And if it stopped just because of the bill, then did we change all the laws and all the rules that were set up to oppress? Why is this important? It's significantly important. And the significance of it is, if we are going to stop police violence against people of color, and the systems and the laws that were established to protect police officers, qualified immunity, numerous laws, and I'll give you an example, but numerous laws made to protect police officers. If these were established years and years ago, when we can acknowledge that the system was racist, there's systematic racism, then if those laws and those rules and those regulations are still here, then is systematic racism not existing? Just because everybody says it doesn't exist, it just went away? Example of a terrible law. So the police get to watch in many locales. The police get to if there's a killing or there's a crime that takes place, if there's a dispute between how the police and the victim interact, the police are allowed to see in many locales are allowed to see the tape, have to see the tape, and even the police's lawyer and the union are allowed to see the tape between 24 to 72 hours before the victim or the victim's lawyer are allowed to see the tape. Why is that? Some people say it's so that we can make sure that any kind of criminal prosecution has to be looked through and make sure any sensitive information, or is it because that allows them to be able to get their story straight, to be able to change documents, or to be able to put in their report and make sure that whatever they have matches up with the tape before it's released to the public. And so rules like this, systematically in the system, they disproportionately affect people of color more. That's the definition of systematic racism. And so if you're going to sit back and you're going to say, well, America's not racist, that's fine. You can say whatever you want to, but you can't sit back and say that systematically there's no racism. Now let's pivot a little bit because we got a comment. And that is, as the church, as Christians, we have a responsibility to point out injustice or sin, as well as promote forgiveness for confessed sins. Yes. And then, I like that. You're right. As the church, we have a responsibility to point out injustice and sin, not to whitewash it, not to act like it doesn't exist, and not to give people cover and a pass for sins that they may have participated in or benefited from. And so what Tim Scott sat back and did, and the reason we can talk about this in the church, man, because he's the one who brought up church. He's the one out there. I want to quote some scriptures in my political speech, or quote scriptures that I manipulated and mixed in with a song and remixed it for my political speech. So we can talk this, and it's fair game. The reason you're giving people a pass on their sins based on what you want, based on what's going to politically help you, based on your friends. And you're ignoring what may be done against others. Do unto others as you would like them to do unto you. Treat your neighbor as yourself. That's not what police officers are doing when they're shooting people in the back, when they're shooting people who are unarmed, when they're not giving a person an opportunity. You don't even give them commands. You just roll up and you just start shooting. Or because you got mad because they're not following your commands, they're shooting. Or you're just mad because they have their hands up and you want to spray them in the face with pepper spray. You can't give people passes and just be like, well, no, there's no problem here. So as Christians, if we want to, our responsibility is to point that out. You can't forgive it if you can't confess it. You can't move on and change it and fix it if you can't acknowledge it. And so, black man to black man. He's complaining about being called Uncle Tom, and Facebook had to, or Facebook or Twitter, I can't remember now. Basically had to shut people down because they started calling him Uncle Tim, because his name is Tim Scott, and as a derogatory term towards him. If you as black man to black man, if you're gonna sit back here and you're gonna have your one opportunity, and you're gonna to be able to talk about racism, you're gonna be able to talk about the things that can help us, and you want to talk about police reform, you want to talk about your bill, you want to even talk about being a Christian, how that changed your life, you want to talk about your grandfather and how he inspired you even though he couldn't read. And he couldn't read because there wasn't education for black people the same way, educational opportunities and economic opportunities. And you want to talk about that, and you really want to try to hammer home and help out your people. Then you can't spend your one shot trying to tell us that one, racism isn't there, and two, that the people who may be participating or benefiting from it, y'all are good, don't worry about it. You know what's even worse is when you make them feel bad. It's called reverse racism. You don't want to make them feel bad. It's not time well spent. And so I know this is a little bit different of a conversation than we normally have, but I think it's important that we understand that just because your skin is black, just because you say that you want to help out, and even if your intentions you think are wanting to help out, if your goal is to make people feel good at the expense of actually having some change and having some stuff done, then you're not helping out. It's not too many. I don't know. I honestly don't know a person. I may know one. I don't know a person who knows about who's informed on what's going on in our government. A black person who's informed of what's going on in our government, who thinks that Tim Scott really is trying to represent and really trying to help out the black community. I don't know anybody that again, maybe one. And the reason is because when you talk, or when you have an opportunity to talk, you don't talk to the community. And so I think that it's our fight and our opportunity to make sure that people like him understand that this is not the time to try to make other people feel good. And it kind of goes back to what what was just said, which is we need to start making people feel a little bit more uncomfortable. We got to be a little bit more aggressive with how we're doing, a little bit more, what Maxine Waters said, a little bit more confrontation, because we're spending our time trying to make people feel good. Well, we need to be spending our time saying directly what the issues are, spending our time fighting directly to the issues. It doesn't mean going out here and causing ruckus and causing problems, but not letting so many things slide by. Not being a bunch of Tim Scotts and sitting here and trying to make other people feel good and then maybe get a little bit of policy change. Not making sure that your politics is something that you do or you participate in, and realize that being a person of color is somebody who you are. Like, that doesn't change. And so I think that people like that may not be in the conversation. And we need to continue to have the conversation to inform folks, because we have different opinions about how things are going on, but we need to continue to inform folk like, hey, racism is real. We're really being hurt out here. This is not time to be playing around and trying to appease people because, those are the ones who give you money or whatnot. Another comment, racism is not a political issue, it's a moral issue. Yes. And that's what's so disturbing about. You made sure that you didn't say racism, except for when you were saying reverse racism, and except for when you were saying the country's not racist. Now, it should be a moral issue. You should be able to sit back and say we don't want that. It's a moral issue. You don't sit here and talk about churches being closed, but you don't want to talk about people being a neighbor to one another, loving one another, being a neighbor to one another. You're not going to sit back and you want to talk about churches being closed or shut down, but you don't want to, you don't, how do you not talk about the fact that Asian Americans are being abused? You want to talk about the funding and stuff that Black people may be getting for HBCUs. But then you don't turn around and talk about the fact that one of the things that people groups such as Black Lives Matter wanted to do was divert some of the funding from police into the community. So maybe if you believe that the problem is education, or the problem is that the activities aren't there in those communities, then maybe we can divert some of that money and start buying so many guns and bulletproof vests and what they call street legal tanks, and maybe divert that to some programs or social programs that's going to help people. It's a moral issue, like the comment said, it's a moral issue. And so I know this kind of was like a little fuss session to get it off of my chest, and so so I apologize if that's not where you wanted to go, but that's where we went today, and that's why we really didn't have anyone else on here, because it was just going to be a fuss session, and less of a conversation outwardly and more of a conversation of, we need to make sure that when people talk, when people talk and they say where they are and they say what they're doing, that we communicate back and we let them know, hey, I don't agree with that. That's not really helping the cause. Nothing he said. I'll tell you what he didn't say as a black man. He didn't say that his life matters. He didn't say that his children's life matters. He didn't say that his mother and his grandfather that he had in such high regard. He didn't say that their lives matter, because he couldn't. Now, you could say that white lives matter because they don't need to be felt like they're racist in any way. But he couldn't say that black lives matter. And the question is, why? Why couldn't you, Tim? Why couldn't you just, even if you don't like the organization, hey, man, I'm not down with the political organization, but the truth of the matter is that as a black person, our lives matter. It's because you're not really trying to help the cause in that way. You're trying to help them maybe in your way. Maybe he wasn't able to speak to the issue of racism because his church is closed. Maybe so, because his church has been shut down. I don't know why. Maybe they don't have TVs. I don't know. Come on, Tim, you got a little dough. Maybe you need to help them out. But maybe so. Maybe so. Well, that's what we have today. Now, next week, we're going to be right back at it with guests. Unfortunately, as we talk, things are not changing as rapidly as they should be. In North Carolina, as we talked about last week with Andrew Brown Jr., they just laid him to rest, and yet still they have not gotten the tape to see what the police did. To see why and how the police shot him 5 times with the fatal shot in the back of the head. Protests are still going on. Questions are still being asked. Answers are still not being given. And so we're going to continue to have this discussion. And another thing that we're going to be able to discuss now is a new dynamic, or not a new dynamic. It's a dynamic of when an elderly white lady is roughed up by the police, the response that comes without protest, without significant uproar from the community, what response happens there versus the response that happens when a black person is treated the same way or even worse. And so that'll be the continuing conversation that we have next week. I hope you join us next week. Please do. Please continue the comments. And again, if you want to continue this conversation, it doesn't stop. Go on Facebook. Go ahead and put your comments in the comment section, even after the fact, and we will continue this conversation. I thank you for joining us. Hopefully this conversation was beneficial. And if you haven't seen what's been said, and if you're not a political person, and I understand politics to many people is just a bore, and it really is. It is, but it's important, and it's important to know what our leaders and our political leaders are doing and saying. It's important to know what African Americans are doing and saying as well about these issues, especially because these issues directly are a direct impact of what is coming on against them. And so when you have people who have experienced racism, discrimination, you want to see what their response is. You want to see what their calls for solutions are, and to see if we can all get to a place where, not all of us, but as much as of us that can get to a place where we can move this along so that we can see some significant change. Until police officers lose their qualified immunity, I don't think anything will change. Until they start getting hit in the pocket, I don't think anything significantly will change. And until we have people who are more worried about the victims who are actually getting killed than worried about other people who are not in those streets or in those fights' feelings, then nothing will change. Thank you for joining us. This is Impact 2021. My name is Nathaniel. Have a good one.